Welcome to a special edition of Hank Unplugged. This is Dr. Larry Johnston, pinch hitting for Hank while he is overseas speaking at an international conference. As usual on Hank Unplugged, you're about to hear a conversation with one of the most interesting, informative, and inspirational people around. It's my distinct pleasure to bring you a conversation with Dr. Markos. Lou is a professor of English and a scholar in residence at Houston Baptist University. Lou is an author of 18 books and a contributor to the Christian Research Journal, CRI's flagship publication. And we're pleased to be offering his latest book, Atheism on Trial, to listeners like you who are supporting the ongoing work of the Christian Research Institute. If you'd like to learn more about joining the CRI support team and equipping yourself and others with essential tools like Lou's book, Atheism on Trial, simply head to equip.org. Lou, having truly feasted on your book, Atheism on Trial, it's great to get a chance to talk to you. Thanks for taking time out from what I know is a busy schedule to join us today.
Thanks, Larry. It's great to be here.
Lou, as you know certainly better than most, critics and skeptics for 2 millennia have been putting Christianity on trial. And like other serious Christian scholars over the century, you've decided to return the favor and put atheism on trial. And what's cool is that you have invited us all to take our place in the jury box as you do so.
I think it's about time. We've been on the defensive so often. I think we need to go on the offensive, not to be offensive, but to understand that we have a worldview that is more integrated and coherent than any other worldview out there. And we do not have to be ashamed of the gospel, either in an emotional, spiritual way or in a logical, rational way. We have the worldview, and we need to be unashamed and to come forward and speak up for it.
Amen. Having really genuinely benefited from your book, and one that I'll no doubt be reading more than once, I have a boatload of questions for you, and can we dive right in?
Let's dive in.
Terrific. In your introduction, you note that the modernist story portrays human civilization as a staircase that begins in darkness, ignorance, superstition, and barbarism, and ever so slowly ascends toward light, truth, science, secular humanism. I'm guessing that you have a problem with that narrative.
I do, and the problem is that this narrative has been fed to us so much that we don't even realize it is a constructed narrative. We have just taken for granted that this is somehow true. This is the way that things are and have been for the last 1,000 of years. But this is a modern construct. It's only as old as the Enlightenment, and really it's even less old than that in terms of the general public. We have been convinced, and I mean Christians now, Christians, we who believe the revelation of the Scripture, who believe that Christ is risen from the dead, without realizing it, like a fish in water, without realizing it, we have imbibed this notion that at the core of history is this thing called progress, that things naturally get better and better, that people get smarter and smarter, and that every time we have a new development, it somehow makes all the things before it wrong. C.S. Lewis came to call this chronological snobbery. The idea, 2 ideas. One is that if something is newer, it must be better. But deeper than that, what chronological snobbery means is if modern civilization no longer believes in something, let's say miracles, that must be because it was disproved by someone at some point. But guess what? That's not true. A lot of the things we no longer believe, I mean, the secular society no longer believes, they just stopped believing it. They may have thought they disproved it, but they didn't. They just stopped believing it and convinced themselves, and to a certain extent even believers, that all that old, quote, medieval stuff is old and has somehow been superseded by new developments in science or technology or psychology or anthropology or philosophy or whatever it is. But the fact of the matter is, these things, the tenets of Christianity, have not been disproven. They've just been moved beyond by people who have other motives. We may talk about those motives later. But the narrative is simply not true. We've imbibed it, we think it's true, but it's not. Our world has not created a genius on the level of, say, Aquinas or Dante or Aristotle or Augustine. Just because it's newer doesn't mean it's better.
Yes, some stories, like the modernist story, become not just narratives, but metanarratives. What's the distinction between narrative and metanarrative, and what is the significance of stories achieving a metanarrative status?
It's a good question. A narrative, of course, is just any story. But a metanarrative is the controlling story. Now, as Christians, we do have a metanarrative, and that metanarrative is the story of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. That is the overarching story of which we are a part, going back to Adam and Eve, to the fall, to Christ, and looking forward to the second coming when there will be a new heaven and a new earth. That is the meta. Meta means over, like metaphysics. That's the meta-narrative, the overarching narrative into which all other stories fit. Well, what the modern world has done is given us a new meta-narrative, and that's if there's one word, it's the word evolution. It is the idea that all things evolve, not just in terms of Darwin's idea of species evolving, but that everything evolves and somehow gets better, and everything else, like Christianity, gets left on the ash heap of history. So a meta-narrative means that this is your essential story, this is your essential truth, and everything else must be fit into that. Let me give you another example of a simple meta-narrative. From a Christian point of view, the meta-narrative says that everything begins in the spiritual realm and works its way down into the physical realm. In the beginning, God. Everything is spiritual in the beginning, and out of that comes the physical. Not so the modern meta-narrative, which completely flips that on its head and says the origin of everything is matter, nature, physical things, and out of that evolves spiritual things. Or to put it in a simple way, God did not create man in the Christian meta-narrative. Man ultimately created God in the modernist meta-narrative.
Yeah, you touched on this briefly in passing, but I think it was the philosopher Santayana who said, I'm not sure entirely who it was that first discovered water, but I know it wasn't a fish. Kind of by way of analogy, this speaks to what you touched on, that like water to fish, we live within these meta-narratives so much that we're totally unaware of them, and that we can effortlessly, unconsciously get trapped in these bubbles.
Let me give you a good example of that bubble that only struck me maybe 5 years ago, just kind of as a moment of revelation. Any Christian that reads the Bible, we notice that in the Old Testament, God has these kosher laws, which seem rather strange to us, not allowing Jews to eat pork or shellfish. And we try to figure out why that is. And me, like almost all modern Christians, we just take for granted that, we now know that pork and shellfish carry more diseases than a lot of other kinds of meats or other kinds of proteins, as the kids would call it today. And so, therefore, the reason God forbade pork and shellfish must be for health reasons. Now, that may be true, Larry, but it didn't strike me till a while ago that in making that immediate assumption, I was playing in to this modern meta-narrative that says God would not do something unless he had a good, logical, scientific health reason. And because we now worship health almost more than anything else, we just take for granted. We don't even think about it. We're in that water. We're in that scientific health water. And so immediately, as a sort of knee-jerk reaction, we think that must be the reason. Now, like I said, it might be the reason, but certainly the Old Testament says nothing about that. It's got something to do with holiness, which is a lot harder concept for us living in the modern world to understand. So again, it's very, very hard to think outside that bubble even if you are a Christian who has access to God's direct revelation in the scriptures and the prophets and Christ himself. It's hard to think outside that bubble. And because science and technology have in many ways improved our lives, particularly in terms of health and labor-saving devices, we just take for granted now that therefore science, as is practiced today, must have all the answers for everything else. We're in the bubble, and it's hard to see it.
And what advice would you give to those who are seeking to be aware of and perhaps break through their own bubbles, or to use an expression of yours that I like, to clear their eyes? What counsel would you give people who are aware of the tendency to effortlessly, unconsciously be embedded in these bubbles? How do we get out?
I tell you, one of the ways, this is kind of funny, but I think one of the most important disciplines to have when you become a husband or wife is the ability to sit down, if you're the man, if you're the husband, to be able to sit down and have a dialogue, internal dialogue, between yourself and your father, and try to figure out why you do the things that you do in your marriage. And if you really analyze yourself, you might notice that, let's say your wife said something and you got really mad, and you don't know why. And then you stop and say, wait a minute, I know why I got mad, because that's the kind of thing that would have made my father exactly mad if my mother said that. And suddenly we've stepped out of ourselves and realized that we have internalized something so much we think it's ours when it isn't. We need to have that second vision. We need to step back and say, why did I say that? Why did I jump to that conclusion so quickly? Like the example I gave about the kosher laws. Why is it that without any thinking, I immediately took for granted it has to do with health? It's a way of having a sort of dialogue with yourself. Now, of course, the best way to heal this chronological snobbery is to read. And my book is a book of apologetics, but you might call it a book of historical apologetics, because I take the reader and myself through history looking at the Christians from the early church. And as I read them, suddenly I'm shocked and say, oh my gosh, there's nothing new under the sun. They struggled with these things as well. It's not something new that no one's ever heard of before. So, I mean, reading older, but not just new books, but reading older books, even sometimes pre-Christian writers like Plato and Aristotle, will give us a kind of distance and objectivity that will allow us to look at ourselves and think through why we think the way we think and why we react the way we do. And I'll just give you a real quick example here. I didn't come up with this. I read it in an article many years ago. But they said that the good Christian people fighting for pro-life, fighting against abortion, made a real deep error when they started adopting the language of rights. Because that's in the air and because it seems so American, we always talk in terms of the language of rights. The trouble is, if you do that, you're going to kind of lose. If you put the rights of the mother up against the rights of an unborn child. Our problem was we never should have adopted the language of rights. We should have stayed with the traditional language of duty and responsibility. But we get so caught up in this idea of rights and wanting our rights that we've adopted that language and hurt ourselves. Another example is when we had Christians, and I mean particularly conservative Christians that are fighting for the accuracy of the Bible, we made the mistake of arguing for the Bible on modern scientific terms rather than on the terms on which it was written. And what happens is we end up losing because we are taking a foreign concept and pushing it upon something that wasn't working within that concept. So again, it's a matter of getting objective distance, of stepping back and analyzing the way our mind works and the way it leaps from one conclusion to another. It's not an easy thing, but it's important. And it's not that different than, in a weird way, going to a good therapist who gets you to look at your behaviors and try to figure out why I get so anxious and paranoid when this happens.
Yeah, I think related to those points, those people that know me know that I'm kind of a quote freak. I'm just always intrigued with the way that great minds have said things in powerful, memorable ways. And one of my favorite quotes of all time is a quote from the philosopher John Locke, who said, "In truth, the ideas and images in men's minds are the invisible powers that constantly govern them." I think Locke is onto something enormously significant here, and I think it might even be reflected in Proverbs 4:23, which says, "Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it." Now, the only problem that I have with that is that when we say heart, I think today people tend to moralize that and thus limit the application. And if I were giving an updated translation of that, I would say, today, above all else, guard your mind, for everything you do flows from it. Any thoughts on that?
Take every thought captive in Christ Jesus.
Yeah, amen.
And now what we have to add is, because we live in a visual age, not just take every thought captive, but take every image captive. Now, obviously, as Christians, we understand the meaning of that when it comes to something like pornography. That's pretty obvious. But there are other images that have nothing to do with pornography that sometimes get into us, and we can't break out of them. I mean, maybe a good example of this is ever since Newton. Now, Newton was coming from a Christian or at least theistic point of view. People debate that. But was certainly coming from a believing standpoint, believing in God. But coming out of Newton, we've ended up moving into what's often called a clockwork universe. We start imagining that we're living in a great machine. And what happens is that we begin by treating nature and creation and the heavens as a machine, and sooner or later we end up being part of that machine, as you would in a totalitarian government, where you are a cog in the machine. We need to understand that the universe is creation. It's not just a machine. It does run by laws, but we need to watch out. We start by treating nature as an object, as a thing to be studied and manipulated, and we end up treating man as an object to be manipulated. See, a lot of that comes out of an image. I'll give you, I know you're a Chesterton fan like I am. One of my favorite Chesterton quotes comes from the book Orthodoxy. And he says, people keep telling me we live in a clockwork universe. And they argue that by saying, every day the sun rises, every day the sun sets, it's always the same. It must be a clockwork universe. And he stops and says, wait a minute. What if every morning God looks at the sun and says, do it again? And every night he looks at the moon and says, do it again. Sometimes when you're an adult, you put a little kid on your knee and you bounce him again and again and again until you're tired. And then you're all done and the kid looks at you and says, again. And you do it again until you're exhausted. Because the child, like God the Father, is full of energy and joy and never gets tired of monotony, whereas we have grown old and weary, and all we can see is the same old thing, and we've lost our joy for the beauty of nature. Maybe all daisies look alike because God never gets tired of making daisies.
Yeah, great.
So it's a matter of, to use a C.S. Lewis phrase, of baptizing not only our mind, but baptizing our imagination, to see the world afresh again and not let it just become a machine, an object to be studied. The universe isn't just our house, it's our home that God created for us.
Yeah. Just want to mention that we're offering Lou's book, Atheism on Trial, this month to all of those people who are standing with CRI in this very crucial month of June, the end of our fiscal year. To receive a copy, simply go to equip.org or phone 888-7000-CRI. That's 888-7000-CRI. Or if you prefer to give by mail, simply send your gift to CRI at Post Office Box 8500, 8500, Charlotte, North Carolina. That's 28271. Lou, in your book, you spend a fair amount of time addressing the contributions of a lot of different philosophers to some of the critical issues that we're discussing. But for those folks who weren't philosophy majors, When you talk about the pre-Socratic philosophers, who were the pre-Socratics, and in what sense were they evolutionists 2,000 years before Darwin?
Great. And let's talk about this, because the whole point of my book is that the new atheists want us to believe that they've come up with all these new arguments that will knock out Christianity for good. What I argue, and not just argue, but demonstrate by quoting the people, is that these arguments have been around for 2,600 years. And it really starts with a group of people called the pre-Socratic philosophers. They're called pre-Socratic because they come between 50 and 150 years before Socrates, starting about 600 BC. They have names like Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes and Parmenides and Pythagoras and then Heraclitus, lots of different names. And these pre-Socratics, we don't have any books from them. What we have are fragments that are quoted by, say, Plato or Aristotle or Cicero or later people. So you can't buy a full book by one of these people, but you can buy a book of pre-Socratic philosophy and look at the various fragments that have been preserved. But we have enough preserved that we can understand the basic arguments they were writing. And yes, they were the first evolutionists. They decided, first of all, to stop asking questions like who and why. Those are the questions that religious people tend to ask. Who, pointing to God, why, motivation. And they said, all we care about is what and how. We want sort of technical, programmatic answers. We're not interested in ultimate origins. We're just interested in the nature of things and how it works. And many of these pre-Socratics were evolutionists in the sense that they believed that at the core of everything was not spirit, but at the core of everything was matter. What a lot of people don't understand until they start reading old books is that the Bible is absolutely unique by beginning, in the beginning, God. It's not just in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Those four words are absolutely revolutionary. In the beginning, God. Because in every other ancient book, whether you're looking at Greek mythology, Roman, Norse, Egyptian, Native American, whenever you go back and look at their stories, it's always not in the beginning God, but in the beginning stuff, in the beginning matter. The Greeks had a word for it that's come directly into our language. That word is chaos. And the word chaos means undifferentiated matter. And they believe that this is true of every ancient myth, including what I'm going to be calling the myth of evolution, that in the beginning, all there was matter floating around, and just randomly by chance, that matter slowly evolved into all the things that we know. And guess what? Not only did we, human beings, come out of the matter, if they believed in gods, they believed that the gods came out of the matter as well. In the beginning is matter, not God, not spirit, but stuff. And they, the pre-Socratics, probably the best way we know them today is they're the ones that started talking about how everything was composed of the four elements: earth, air, fire, and water. That idea goes right on through the Renaissance, almost into the Enlightenment, used in different ways. But they were interested in finding the physical, material, natural building blocks of things. And even if they did believe in the gods, they found them irrelevant in terms of explanation or science. They just sort of left them on the side and argued. Now, the most fascinating of all was a man named Epicurus, the founder of Epicureanism, and he and his famous poet heir, a man named Lucretius, who wrote in the 1st century BC, they had a really kind of cool idea. They were called atomists. Now, an atom, that's a Greek word that means cannot be divided. So an atom is the smallest unit of matter. And what the atomists, like Epicurus and Lucretius, believed is that everything in the universe is composed of either an atom, a little bit of matter, or space, a void. That's all there is. These atoms moving through empty space, what they called the void, and they just moved on randomly. And every so often, for no reason, one of them swerved and hit another one. And out of that swerve comes everything that we know. It's basically evolution. It's a view of the world that's binary. Everything's a 1 or a 0, and out of the random dance of those atoms comes everything that we know. So again, this idea that everything we see around us could have arrived here merely through physical, natural processes and time and chance was in no way invented by Darwin or the evolutionists of the 19th century. That's been around with us for at least 2,600 years and has been debated for that long. And it's never been proven, of course.
Yeah, if we say in the beginning today, most Christians would complete that with, God created the heavens and the earth. But for most secularists, when you say in the beginning, a natural association that they would make is, of course, the Big Bang. But
right.
A lot of Christians have not thought through the theistic implications or the theological implications of the Big Bang. And I'm curious as to how really dedicated materialists like Carl Sagan and Stephen Hawking avoided those implications.
It really is amazing. It's so disingenuous. I mean, Stephen Hawking, he's one of the ones that popularized the Big Bang in the beginning, his famous book, A Brief History of Time and whatnot. He popularized it until suddenly he realized, I'm not sure what moment he realized, the theistic implication, that if there's a Big Bang, there must be a Big Banger. Because in fact, there is nothing before the Big Bang. The Big Bang didn't just create matter. The Big Bang created matter and space and time. Before the Big Bang, there was nothing. And I think at some point he suddenly realized, I'm in trouble. And then he started doing, I'm sorry, this is not even science. This is science fiction. One of the things that Stephen Hawking did, and others have jumped in on it, but he tried to get around the theistic implications of there was a beginning to the universe and there was nothing before that beginning. The way he got around it was by theorizing what he called multiverse theory, multiple universe, multiverse theory. And he's like, it is impossible for a universe just to pop out of nowhere, right? Because, literally, the odds of getting what we have by chance, the odds actually exceeds the number of atoms in the universe. The odds would be literally like throwing a dart and hitting one atom in the entire universe. Okay, that just doesn't happen. But he theorized, what if an infinite number of universes are always popping into being, popping, dying, back and forth? If that were the case, then the odds would be okay that one of those universes would be the kind that we have that allows for human life, or life of any kind, but especially of human life. Now, this is what the people who speak Yiddish would call chutzpah, okay? You cannot explain how one universe came into being by chance, and so you get out of that by theorizing that billions of them came out of nowhere.
Madness.
So this is how they get away with it is unbelievable. But, to the day he died, he kept trying. Now, later, in the 5 years or so before he died, then he started coming up with other theories. He said, all we really need, right, for order is the law of gravity. If we have the law of gravity, that can organize things. Okay, first of all, there's two problems there. Number one, there is nothing before the Big Bang. Now, all of a sudden, he's suggesting the law of gravity. There's nothing before the Big Bang. But even beyond that, again, the modern secularist has this way of taking words like gravity, nature, and chance and imbuing them with some kind of consciousness and ability to do things. The law of gravity doesn't do anything. In fact, the law of gravity has no meaning until there is physical matter that's moving. So you can't have a law of gravity before the Big Bang because there's nothing. The law of gravity measures something. It doesn't actually cause stones to fall to earth. It merely is a law that measures that attractive power. So he keeps getting. One of my favorite ones, though, is Carl Sagan. Now, again, if you're my age, or if you've been around for a while, you'll remember. I guess it must have been around 1980, 1979, when Carl Sagan came out with the famous show called Cosmos, which has been rebooted. Right, that deGrasse Tyson, whatever his name is. I think
Yes.
he rebooted it. But the original Cosmos, again, that way, when we watched that on PBS, everybody was glued to their television sets on Sunday night. Now, Carl Sagan began that show with a famous phrase that he seems to think is scientific, but is absolutely metaphysical and philosophical. He began by saying the cosmos is all there is, all there ever was, and all there ever will be. Now, first of all, you realize that that's a very kind of nasty stealing of Revelation chapter 4, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty who was and is to come. Now, suddenly the cosmos is all there ever is, all there ever was, all there ever will be. But here's the problem with that statement. Now, in the year 1980, regular dudes like you and I did not know that the Big Bang had been proven. It hadn't quite made its way into popular culture. But by 1980, any scientist who was in the inn, like Carl Sagan, knew. But long before 1980, they had already basically proven the Big Bang because they saw the universe was expanding. They even found what's called the smoking gun, the background radiation. So Carl Sagan himself knew about the Big Bang. And yet he makes this unbelievably disingenuous thing saying the cosmos is all there ever was. He's still going back. Okay, throughout the 20th century, a lot of top scientists, including and especially Einstein, fiercely resisted what he saw. He noticed that the universe was expanding. He knew what this meant. If it was expanding from a point, it must have started. And Einstein himself fiercely resisted the idea that the universe had a beginning because he knew what the implications were. And he even came up with what he would later call a fudge factor to try to explain away the expansion of the universe. And later on, he admitted it was probably the biggest scientific mistake he'd made. They wanted to believe in the 20th century in what they called the steady state theory, the belief that the universe or cosmos has always been here. And again, that's been, as much as science can disprove anything, has been disproven. The universe has a beginning, and that beginning came out of nothing. So suddenly, in the beginning, God becomes a sort of scientific statement. It's funny how things come around.
What I find absolutely fascinating, and this simply revisits the power of metanarrative, when I read minds as bright as Carl Sagan and Stephen Hawking, I keep coming up against what I call Houdini hermeneutics.
I love that.
They are so committed to the ABT position, anything but theism. They just absolutely cannot allow a divine foot in the door, that they will bend and distort, filter, refract, state metaphysical statements in an effort to make them scientific, and they're unaware of their own encapsulation. You know, I'm intrigued. At one point in your book, you refer to the Darwinian myth, because definitions of myth vary. In what sense is Darwinism a myth?
Okay, the word myth doesn't necessarily mean a lie. A myth is a story usually either about origins or about endings, like the afterlife or punishment and reward and things like that. A myth is a story that helps us to understand why things are the way they are. Sometimes it may be merely a story. Other times it can have historical validity to it. But the trouble, and this goes right back, the founder of the intelligent design movement was a great guy named Philip E. Johnston. And in his book called Darwin on Trial, I don't know, maybe 25 years now that came out, 20 years? I'll never forget it. Philip E. Johnston made this statement everybody should memorize. He says, there is the theory of Darwinism and the fact of Darwinism. And the Darwinists want to make that distinction. They want to say that the theory of, or let's say evolution, that the theory of evolution is whatever theory we're using right now, whatever fusion of ideas. That's the theory of evolution. But that should be contrasted with the fact of evolution. That is, that it actually happened. As Philip E. Johnston argues, there is no difference between the fact of evolution and the theory of evolution. They are the same thing. There is no fact of evolution separate from the stories they keep telling us. And a good example of that is that the modern theory of Darwinian evolution is really anti-Darwinian, because the biggest thing that Darwin said over and over is that nature takes no leaps. The word for a leap in Latin is saltation. There's no saltation. Nature cannot leap. Everything has to be slow, incredibly slow, gradual changes. And Richard Dawkins is always saying that to us as if we're 5-year-olds trying to explain it to us again and again and again. But in fact, modern Darwinian evolution believes that there is this thing called mutations that cause sudden changes in species. That comes from a guy named Stephen Gould.
Yes.
Stephen Jay Gould came up with a theory called punctuated equilibrium, or punk-eep, that shows how species just suddenly leap forward due to mutations. So the modern theory of Darwinian evolution is almost anti-Darwinian because it keeps taking leaps. But the point is that the theory is always changing, always playing the Houdini hermeneutics you just explained, but there is no fact of it. There's just the story that we want to hold on to. And you need to understand that, okay, if you believe in modernism, if you believe the idea that in the beginning there's only matter and everything comes out of matter and everything is by chance, okay, if that is your meta-narrative, well, every meta-narrative has to have an origin story to justify itself. I mean, if you're a Darwinian and you have a certain view of the universe, but you can't explain how you got here, that's a pretty sorry meta-narrative, a pretty sorry story. And I'm making this point, Larry, because there's something that a lot of people haven't recognized. Okay, when you look at the founders of modernism, you do know that Marx has very much been shown to be in error in so many ways. He's really, I mean, there are still Marxist places, but Marx has been discredited in many ways. Freud has been discredited in many ways. Sartre has been, almost all the founders of Margaret Mead has been discredited. But the one person that the Academy will not discredit is Darwin. They just keep holding on to him, and they won't let go of him. And to me, it's kind of nonsensical. Could you imagine if you said to me, hey, the Earth rotates around the sun, and you tried to prove that to me by going back to Galileo? Okay, you really don't have to go back to Galileo. Okay, we got plenty of proof of that right now. But when it comes to evolution, people come going back to Darwin, who got so many things wrong. Darwin thought that our cells were just a little blob of material. He didn't have even an inkling of the unbelievable complexity of the DNA and the miniature machines, the molecular machines that run through our body at a microscopic level. And yet people keep going back to Darwin and will not let him go, as if he proved something. You see what I mean? It's very, very odd. But people will not let go of Darwin. And they will, I mean, even a lot of Christian apologists sometimes are too timid to speak up against Darwin because he is defended to the last. Everybody else can be thrown to the lions, but not Darwin, because we can't have our meta-narrative if we don't have a sense of how we got here ourselves.
Yeah, a very prominent Chinese scientist was visiting the United States, and after he had been in the United States some time, he posed the profound observation that he said, in the United States, we can question God, but not Darwin. And in China, you can question Darwin, but not God. Again, it shows the power of meta-narrative. In your book, you talk about a good number of philosophers. Spinoza is one, and he's I think a towering figure in philosophy, but one that many Christians would be unfamiliar with. Who was Spinoza, and what did he mean when he said that God and nature are one?
Let me talk about Spinoza. I have a good friend that I dedicated my book to. His name is Gilbert Farah, and he's the one that got me. He's a believer and a skeptic back and forth. He's a good partner that I debate with all the time. And he's the one that finally got me to sit down and read Spinoza's Ethics. And after I read it, I was just amazed because he's very rarely taught. You hear the name, but I don't remember ever learning any. And I went to all secular schools. I don't remember learning anything about Spinoza. And when I read it, it was like the missing piece explaining modernism. Spinoza's only a little bit after Descartes. He's actually before the Enlightenment, 17th century, but he's blazing the way for things that are to come. And in one sense, I respect Spinoza because he was a very brave person. I mean, he was actually one of the few people, he was Jewish, but secular Jewish, but he was rejected by the Jewish community and rejected by the Christian community. I mean, he made everybody mad at him. And he was very, very brave and led a difficult life. But when you read Spinoza, he pretends like he believes in God, but he doesn't. He basically says that God and nature are the same thing. Some people call that monism, that everything is one, as opposed to, and in fact, I do respect Spinoza partly because Spinoza was answering Descartes. Descartes is what we call a dualist. Sometimes we use the word Cartesian dualism in the sense that he made, I would argue, and many would, maybe too profound a split between body and soul. Descartes was certainly a believer. He believed in body, he believed in soul. But in a lot of his writings, he had this way of separating them too much, right, and moving away. So in one sense, Spinoza is answering Descartes and trying to move away from the Cartesian split that body and soul are so distinctive, and coming up instead with an idea that basically body and soul are the same, God and nature are the same. But what really happens in Spinoza, by making God and nature the same, all you really have is nature. Because if God is nature, then he's no longer God. The word God ceases to have all meaning when God is the same thing as nature. And so ultimately, he may use the word God, but he's ultimately an atheist. I mean, because it's just like if our body and soul are the same thing, then we basically have no soul because there's no part of us that can step outside and look at ourselves. In Spinoza, everything is caused by a material chain of causes from which we cannot break. So again, I think he was very brave in attacking the idols of his day, let's say. But again, Spinoza, in unifying God and nature, basically makes God irrelevant and ultimately non-existent. Everything just is, and everything is ultimately nature.
As we think of nature, and I live and spend most of my time in Colorado, where nature is evidence of God's handiwork, many people, Christians and non-Christians, find it absolutely inconceivable that the extraordinary complexity and clear appearance of design in the cosmos could be the result of random chance and blind accident. And I'm curious, how have apologists from Aristotle to people like Philip Johnston and the intelligent design movement, how have they shown that the stunning complexity of our world and of nature just cannot be accounted for by a simple chain of material causes and effects?
Let's step back. Okay, what does intelligent design mean? What it means is that there are all sorts of structures in our universe, including in ourselves on a microbiological level. There are all sorts of structures that point to intelligent design. They could not have gotten there simply by a random system of changes and mutations. That what we see in our universe points to an intelligent designer. It was designed, and there must be some that when we look in the world, there's not just matter and energy. There's matter and energy and information. And the only source of real information that we know of is intelligent design. Now, let's start in a little bit more fun way, because I want to argue, as many of the ID people have, the intelligent design people have, that all the secular scientists actually use intelligent design all the time. And let me give you a real simple example. If you are an anthropologist, and of course you can be a Christian anthropologist, but most anthropologists until very recently have been absolute secular humanists, okay? I mean, just like sociology and psychology, until very, very recently we've been taking those disciplines back. But traditionally, anthropologists, who study ancient man, usually are very, very secular humanists. Now, if you're that, you can start studying an area, right? And you might find a bone here or this there or a piece of rock and whatnot, and you look at it and you can tell right away that it's just random. Weathering caused it to look like that, right? But then you find certain bones or certain flint stones that have clearly been shaped and given a cutting edge. And as a scientist, you can immediately distinguish what is there by chance and the forces of evolutionary weathering and what was actually designed by human creatures. They know right? If you're a sociologist, anthropologist, you can tell the difference between a bunch of stones that have somehow randomly arranged themselves in a circle. You could tell the difference between that and Stonehenge. When you see Stonehenge, you immediately know that this structure has been intelligently designed. Now, you might not know who did it, right? They used to think it was the Druids. Now they think it's actually much, much older than the Druids. But you immediately recognize, if you're going through South Dakota and you look up at the side of a cliff and you see something that roughly looks like a nose and a lip, you can immediately say, oh, that's just weathering, that's just what happens randomly. But then you turn a corner and you see a mountain that has 4 heads on it, and you recognize those 4 heads as belonging to 4 presidents that you've studied in school, and you immediately recognize that Mount Rushmore was intelligently designed and didn't just happen, right? Here's my favorite example, Larry. Again, if you're a little bit of a nerd like you and I, we all know that Carl Sagan started something that all the geeky boys like. It's called SETI. Do you remember what SETI stands for, Larry?
Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence.
Yeah, you know, see, it's great. All the guys know this, right? The search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And what was Carl Sagan doing? He was scouring the universe for any sign of intelligence. And you know what? If he found something like, I don't know, a quasar beating out the prime numbers, he would immediately recognize, whoa, there is intelligence. This must point to aliens, right? So you when you set up something like SETI, you can distinguish between random things in the universe and something that's designed. So all science knows how to do it. But then suddenly, when you come to our world, and you look inside the human being and you find all of our cells have this microscopic strand of something called DNA that is programmed with more information than any 10 supercomputers, right? An absolutely clear example of intelligent design. And what do you say? It's just random, okay? Random events cannot create information. Because the DNA, you know, even as Bill Gates, people like that, they look at the DNA and they realize it's been programmed. Okay? And yet, suddenly, when we are presented with overwhelming evidence of design, then we jump back and say, oh, it's just random. And actually, I'm talking too much here. But let me prove to you, by the way, that Richard Dawkins knows intelligent design. Okay? There's a wonderful documentary called Expelled with Ben Stein. And in Expelled, Ben Stein, with wonderful humor, tries to show how any scientist these days that tries to practice intelligent design is going to be attacked by the secular community. And at the end, he has a debate with Richard Dawkins. And he starts asking Richard Dawkins what we're talking about right now. You know, how is it possible that the DNA, you know, so front-loaded with information, how can it possibly evolve? What is your answer? And Richard Dawkins says, well, it could have happened like this. Aliens could have seeded the earth with DNA. Of course, those aliens must themselves have evolved by some kind of Darwinian means. Okay, now, a lot of people that watch Expelled jumped on that and said, oh, Ben Stein tricked Richard Dawkins into saying that. He didn't trick Richard Dawkins. If anybody ever reads The God Delusion, about 2/3 of the way through the book, he makes that very argument. It's called Panspermia. It's the idea that aliens seeded our DNA. And do you know who came up with that idea? It was not Richard Dawkins that came up with the idea of panspermia. It was a guy named Crick, as in Watson and Crick, the 2 guys that discovered the double helix organization scheme of the DNA. Now, Crick was an atheist, just like Sagan, just like Richard Dawkins, but he knew that the DNA could not have been evolved, and so he suggested that aliens did it. So what you need to understand is that Richard Dawkins believes in intelligent design. He looks at the DNA, he recognizes it could not have evolved, it must have been designed by intelligence, but because God is off the table, he thinks it's okay to say aliens.
I had to chuckle when you mentioned SETI. I don't know if you recall Senator William Proxmire, but Proxmire, when he was in the Senate many years ago, used to have what I think he called the Golden Fleece Award, which was awarded to those people who are wasting extravagant sums of taxpayers' money.
Yes, yes.
And he actually, the reason he introduced legislation to defund SETI. And his reason for doing so was he said he thought that the funds could be much better spent looking for intelligent life in Washington, D.C.
I love it. That's great. Might be a harder search.
Yeah. Lou, a section of your book, Atheism on Trial, deals with miracles. And among critical thinkers, anyone who attempts to dive deep into the possibility, the probability, the feasibility of miracles is going to encounter at some point the name of David Hume. Who was Hume, and why did he think that miracles were an impossibility?
David Hume is an amazing character, sort of like Darwin. David Hume is somebody that secular humanists are always pointing back to because they believe that he proved certain things that he really didn't prove. He wrote a book in which he spent a chapter in which he thinks that he disproved miracles. He did not do so, but he thinks he does, and he does it in one chapter. Okay, and people continue to point back to Hume as if he did it. And ultimately, there are two facets to this. Okay, ultimately, behind Hume's idea, and many other people today, is miracles violate the laws of nature. Therefore, miracles are impossible. Or let's make the full thing. You cannot violate the laws of nature. They can't be broken. Miracles break the laws of nature. Therefore, miracles don't happen. That would be what we call a syllogism, right? Now, first of all, let's just take a step back. And again, one of the things that really upsets me is people that do New Testament studies and say all sorts of crazy things about the New Testament are often people that don't seem to have read anything else that was written at the same time as the New Testament. In other words, they talk about it as an ancient book, but they don't seem to understand how distinctive the Gospels are from other books. All right, about 50 years, maybe a little bit less, than the writing of the Gospels was a famous book called The Metamorphoses by Ovid. The great Roman Latin poet Ovid wrote a book of mythology in which he tells all sorts of stories about how people turned into ants and into birds and into trees and all sorts of changes, metamorphoses. All right. Now, that book is full of miracles, right? And it was written maybe a generation before the Gospels, which tell all the miracles of Jesus. But if you read those books side to side, you will see how radically different they are. The only reason we can enjoy reading Ovid, and I teach it every year in the Honors College, the only reason we can enjoy teaching Ovid is because we know it's fiction. If we had any idea or fear that anything that happened in Ovid might actually happen in real life, we would be terrified and not read that book, right? Because if those miracles are true, then we're living in a topsy-turvy, arbitrary world where anything can happen. We can't even hold on to our own bodies, right? But if the miracles recorded in the Gospels are true, then everything's wonderful. Then the God who created this universe and created nature has come into it and is in the process of healing it and healing us. So first of all, we need to understand that when the Gospels are actually read in their historical context, we understand that the miracles recorded in them are totally different, okay? They are sober miracles based on eyewitness accounts. Okay, with that as background, now let's start talking about what miracles do. Again, Hume just takes for granted that miracles violate the laws of nature. And for people like Hume, by the way, laws of nature basically is God. And even for Spinoza, God equals nature, but you could almost say God equals the laws of nature, because that's really what they worship, the laws of nature. That's their idol, if you will. Now, yeah, I can understand that if the laws of nature were broken by miracles, as they are again and again in Ovid. But that's not really what happens in the Gospels. Let me give you an example of a miracle. Okay, let's say I take a very expensive Ming Dynasty vase and I hold it up in my right hand and I let it go and drop it. Now, what's going to happen? It's going to fall to the ground and shatter. Why is that going to happen? Because of the law of gravity. You let go, and the laws of gravity that are operative in our world will drag it to the earth and smash it, right? Now, watch this now. I open up my right hand, and the vase starts to fall, but before it hits the ground, my left hand shoots out and catches it. Okay, have I just broken the law of gravity? I've not broken the law of gravity. If I open my left hand, it will continue to fall and shatter. I haven't broken the law of gravity. I have added in a new factor that has suspended the law, but only suspended. Because if I open my left hand, gravity will take over again and the vase will smash. People seem to forget that everybody that Jesus healed in the Holy Land eventually died, right? What Jesus did is temporarily suspend the laws of nature, but once the miracle was done, the regular laws took over. God did this incredible miracle called the virgin birth, in which he himself, however exactly he did it, in which he himself placed the seed inside Mary's womb. But once conception occurred, nature took over, and Mary had a normal 9-month pregnancy and gave birth to Jesus on the first Christmas. Cana of Galilee, I'm quoting C.S. Lewis now in a book he wrote called Miracles. Cana of Galilee, Jesus turned water into wine. Well, every day water turns into wine, but it's a very, very slow process. But when Jesus does it snap in a second, suddenly the mask is off, and we see the miracle that was always there, and we realize that the God of nature, who created it, is now in it and is working. And so miracles do not violate the laws of nature. Miracles, I like to say what a miracle is a wonderful moment when we see what nature was truly meant to be. In the garden, before sin came and before depravity came and before our universe was subjected to futility. But it won't always be. And there are a few miracles, Lewis says, that although they don't violate the laws of nature, transcend them, as when Jesus walks on the water. There, what we're getting is a glimpse of that perfect new heaven and new earth towards which we're leading. Okay, so again, we need to understand what miracles are before we attack them. And Hume just takes for granted miracles violate the laws, therefore they don't happen.
A beautiful quote from my favorite Christian human development scholar, the late James Loder, who was a professor at Princeton Theological Seminary. He had a quote that I've just savored for decades. He said, "Miracle needs to be seen not as a momentary disruption, but as a partial disclosure of the dynamic order that underlies the creation and redemption of the entire universe, the logic of the Spirit that brings order out of chaos and transforms human lives into the human likeness of Christ." I just love that. That is rich.
Beautiful. And, I wish you told me about him, and I wish I had read him, because it's just remarkable. It happened about 20 or 25 years ago, just when I was kind of starting my writing career, and I was thinking about miracles, and again, it just came to me, and this was the phrase that came to me. A miracle is not a violation of the laws of nature, but a sublime act during which the Creator, for a brief, glorious moment, restores the truly natural, that is, original order of his creation. And that just sort of came to me. And out of that, I started writing apologetics. It's one of those things when the blinders come off, when you suddenly wake up and your eyes are clear and you see the glory for what it is. What do we read in Colossians about Jesus? In him, all things consist. I took enough science to remember that we still don't really know why the nucleus of the atom doesn't break apart. Right? Why doesn't it? What holds together the nucleus? There are certain things that we don't, we come up with names, strong nuclear force, weak nuclear, all these names, we don't really understand it. And yet, in him, all things consist. All things hold together. The miracle is around us all the time, and we just don't see it. Right? As Lewis reminds us, to a certain extent, doctors don't heal us. Our body heals itself. What the doctor does is immobilize the wound and fight infection. But it's ultimately the body that heals itself. Again, what God has put into nature, the unbelievable fruition of nature, the magic that this dry, dead thing called an acorn, but you bury it literally in the earth, and out of it springs not only an oak tree, but potentially an entire oak forest. You tell me there's not magic? You know how I raised my kids, Larry? I taught them this simple phrase. The world is full of magic. You just have to have eyes to see it and ears to hear it. Now, you may think I'm going a little crazy here, but remember, I'm an English professor. And one of the things that attracted me to C.S. Lewis the first time I read him is that Lewis spent the first half of his life as an atheist. When Lewis became a believer at the age of 32, guess what? His return to Christianity, that actually allowed him to re-access his love of magic, imagination, and fairy tales. Too often in our country, a lot of Christians think if I'm a Christian, I have to distance myself from fairy tales and imagination and all of that. But no, once we realize that the God who created the world actually entered into the world and became a man and lived and died and resurrected, everything goes on. The great miracle, as Lewis called it, the incarnation, that God could become man. And once you realize that, you see the magic that's all around us, right? I know that's a scary word sometimes for evangelicals like myself, but it's true magic. It's true mystery. It is the paradox at the center of everything, that Christ is both two and one.
It's wonder, the very important right brain function that has been lost in much of the snarling logicality of left brain dominance in our culture today, and finding a balance between those two hemispheres of the brain and how those two hemispheres of the brain construct reality differently is, in my book, pretty key. I don't know where you are on the two books position, but I am unashamedly a two-booker, believing that God has written two books. He's the author of the book of his works, or nature, and also the book of his word, Revelation. And yet I continue to see consistent errors among what I would call the one-bookers, those who believe only in science or only in the Bible. And I guess a question that I would have is, why is it smart in today's increasingly scientific climate for Christians to be conversant with both books?
I think they need to. And God reveals himself. What we need to remember as Christians is something, and this is great because what I'm going to talk about now is absolutely clear both in Aquinas and in Calvin. Okay, and if those guys can agree on something, I think maybe that's pretty important. Okay, and at the very center of Christian theology is the distinction between general revelation and special revelation. Okay, this is not only key to Catholic theology, this is the way Calvin begins his Institutes. Also, this is the way the book of Romans begins. The difference is general revelation is the way that God speaks to all people at all times. He speaks specifically through two things, through his creation, through nature, and through our conscience. C.S. Lewis would add that he speaks through the good dreams of the pagans as well, right? That God speaks to all people. That's why in Romans chapter 1, we are without excuse because God's nature and glory and power is completely on display in his creation. And that's why in Romans chapter 2, Paul tells us that even the Gentiles who are without the law are a law unto themselves, for the law has been written in their heart, ultimately has been written in their conscience. So it's very clear in the Bible and in biblical theology that God speaks through general revelation, but he also speaks through special revelation. That's when he speaks directly through the Old Testament, the New Testament, the prophets, and supremely through Christ. And we need to pay attention to both. When we speak about natural law, we're really speaking about God's general revelation, the way God speaks to all people through conscience and through nature. And we need to study that, right? Let me kind of put this in a wonderful way. Psalm 19, which was C.S. Lewis's favorite psalm, begins, "The heavens are telling the glory of the Lord. The skies are proclaiming his handiwork," right? God does speak through his creation. But what's really neat about that psalm is the first half of the psalm talks about nature. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they are not silent. Their voice is going out to all the world. But the second half of that psalm moves away from nature and starts talking about the law, the Torah. And what's really cool is in the first half of the psalm, when it's talking about nature, the word used for God, the heavens are telling the glory of the Lord, is the word Elohim, the sort of generic word for God, like we use our own word, God. It's generic, right? But as soon as we start, the psalmist starts talking about the law, it switches to Yahweh, God's covenant name, right? So God speaks to us directly by his covenant name in the law. but he still speaks to us more generally in our conscience and through creation. And we need to access both of those books if we are going to dialogue. Just like Christians are realizing, we need to speak the language of natural law if we are going to engage the secular humanist in the marketplace of ideas, in what was called the naked public square. Richard John Neuhaus called the naked public square. Now, unfortunately, Larry, for a long time, a lot of Protestants, like myself, evangelicals, Calvinists, a lot of us were a little bit leery about natural law because we saw it as more of a Catholic idea. But it's not just a Catholic idea, it's a Christian idea. And slowly and thankfully, more and more Christians in the public square are realizing that we can make connections, we can build a bridge by pointing to things like the natural law and pointing to right now. Hopefully on a one-on-one basis, we may be able to slowly draw people from that natural law into Christ himself. But in terms of the marketplace, in terms of talking to academia, this is a good bridge that we can build and we can begin the conversation. And we need to understand that whatever the secular humanists are saying, almost every major discovery in science in the last 50 years has actually pointed to God and pointed to theism. So if we would be, brave enough to look at that, we would have an incredible ground where we can dialogue.
Yeah, I think one of the points that we don't want lost here is that people today too often succumb to the illusion that many of today's debates are new, when in fact they're at least centuries and sometimes millennia old.
Yeah.
And we don't want serious Christians, thinking Christians, to be unaware that many of these debates were effectively lost by atheists, and that their arguments today are just digging up these desiccated old corpses.
Let me give a really good example of this. Okay. Again, another thing that people like to point to Hume. Not only is it believed that Hume disproved miracles, it's also believed that Hume gave Christianity the knockout punch of all time, what's called the problem of pain, or the problem of suffering and evil. And the problem of pain is very simple to formulate, and Hume formulates it this way himself. According to Christianity, God is all-loving and all-powerful. But the fact that there is pain and suffering in the world suggests either that God is not powerful enough to eradicate the suffering, or is not loving enough to care enough to eliminate it. Now, when Hume made that argument, he was basically quoting Epicurus, one of the early, not exactly pre-Socratic, a little bit later, more like 300, but back to somebody that's BC. This is not a new argument. This argument has been around forever. And it's in the Bible, too, because what's the book of Job and the book of Habakkuk about if it's not about the problem of pain and suffering? So it's been around forever, but people keep going back to it again and again. Well, first of all, let's realize that the problem of pain only becomes a problem if you actually have a God like the God in the Bible. If you don't have a God like the God in the Bible, there is no problem of pain. Right? In fact, if there is no God at all, then we shouldn't even be aware of the fact that the world is unjust. Because the only way you can say something is unjust is if you have something just to measure it against. But if there is no God, if all there is Darwinian survival of the fittest, natural selection, then we wouldn't even have a concept of justice to make us say, oh, that's unjust. Okay? So first of all, the problem is not even a problem until you have a God who reveals himself as all-powerful and all-loving. But let me just mention something here. Okay, first of all, what's really funny about the problem of pain, no matter how often it's drawn out, real philosophers know that on a philosophical level, the argument of the problem of pain has already been resolved by a guy named Alvin Plantinga, one of the most famous living philosophers, a strong Christian. And Alvin Plantinga basically showed philosophically that this is not a problem, because it all depends on how you define the word all-loving and all-powerful. Yes, God's all-powerful, but all-powerful may mean he is able to do everything that it's possible to do. Well, maybe there are some things that are impossible, not because God is not all-powerful, but because this is the kind of world that he created. And maybe loving doesn't mean always removing pain from us, but loving means that God is in control and uses that pain for good. Now, again, any serious philosopher realizes that philosophically that's no longer a problem. Now, of course, it's still a problem emotionally, okay? It's still a problem that if you're a pastor, you need to help counsel people, because we still need to deal with the problem of pain on a personal, individual, emotional level. But as a philosophical argument, it's really on the dust heap now. It really doesn't disprove God. That's been taken care of, but they keep bringing it back because it has great emotional force to come back again and again. Every time there's a natural disaster, out comes the problem of pain. This happened 300 years ago after an earthquake in Lisbon. Voltaire went crazy talking about the problem of pain. It keeps coming back again and again and again because they don't really have anything else. And again, they don't realize that, again, there is no problem of pain unless we have the God of the Bible. If you're a Hindu or Buddhist, there is no problem of pain, because if you're a Hindu or Buddhist, God is nature and therefore is not separate from nature and can't really do anything to protect you anyway. So, craziness.
I think too often we toss around the term God as though there is some consensus, some semantic bargain on who or what God is. We've talked a little bit about the God of the philosophers. You've touched obviously on some biblical glimpses of the nature of God. I'm curious, in what ways would you say is the God of Abraham different from the God of Aristotle?
This is a very important distinction. And what happens, especially with the problem of pain, is people play fast and loose. Okay. What the God of the philosophers is he is the God who starts the Big Bang, but doesn't do anything else. The God of the philosophers is an idea that we need to give us an origin. We need an unmoved mover. We need something to set everything in motion. We need something to give organization and origin to everything. And of course, God is those things, right? But if that's all that God is, then we're not talking about the God of Scripture. We're not talking about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The covenant God who speaks to Abraham is a God who is intimately involved in his world. The God of the philosophers is ultimately a deistic God. A deistic God is often described as the watchmaker God. He's the God who creates the watch, winds it up, and then lets it go off on its own, right? A lot of people treat God that way. That is not the God of the Scriptures. That's why, Larry, I have little to no patience with Christians who call themselves theistic evolutionists, right? Oh, yeah, we believe in God, but everything is Darwin. It's like theistic evolution is another way of saying scientific deism, okay? A God who's not involved at all, okay? The trouble is that what happens is, in philosophical arguments about the problem of pain, they set up this deistic God, this God of the philosophers, right? They set him up, but because he's a God that doesn't do anything, that doesn't really have any likes or dislikes, that doesn't make covenants, that doesn't involve himself in the world, then he's a totally impotent God. And so what you're doing is creating a straw God instead of a straw man. You're creating a God, and then you're attacking that God for doing nothing to help you in a crisis. But of course that God can't help you in a crisis because he's a deistic God that ignores everything, right? So it's a kind of a classic bait and switch kind of ploy. You set up a God who cannot involve himself and doesn't do anything, and then you turn around and attack him for not doing anything. As Lewis said, when I was an atheist, I hated God. I hated God for not existing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of a weird thing. He's one or the other. And so, again, maybe that's the best way. You're setting up a straw God. And this, of course, is a God that doesn't care about anything. He's not a covenant God. The God of the Bible is intimately involved in the world, in the flow of history, and in the individual lives of every person on the planet. That's the real God.
I want to shift gears a bit here because in your book you note very intriguingly for me that if you were given the power for the sake of humanity to prevent the birth of one person in history, it wouldn't be Hitler or Stalin or Mao. Instead, it would be one of the darlings of many secular intellectuals. Who is that?
That is Karl Marx. And Larry, I'm unapologetic about this. I mean, you can find a few things to redeem in Freud and other people like that, but I consider Marx to be the sort of center of so much evil in the world. And the reason why I would stop his birth rather than Hitler or Stalin is because without Marx, those people wouldn't have come along. All right? Karl Marx is a figure who changed the metanarrative in an extremely destructive way. All of this identity politics we have today that's destroying our country, all of it comes out of Marx. Radical feminism comes out of Marx. Almost all radical things. I'm not talking about equal pay for equal work, but the kind of feminism that wants to break down all distinctions between the men and women. All of this stuff goes back to Karl Marx. What Marx did, okay, is he made us, human beings, into mere products of economic forces over which we ultimately have no control. Now, let me try to put it in this way, okay? When we study American history, we have this idea that there was this wonderful bunch of dead white male heterosexual guys that we call the Founding Fathers. And we have this wonderful idea that these Founding Fathers, using their intelligence, studying history, using inspiration from God, fashioned this thing we call liberal democracy and free market capitalism. For Marx, that is a complete illusion. The Founding Fathers didn't create democracy and capitalism. Capitalism created the Founding Fathers. Now, this is a strange thing to say, but basically, for Marx, at the base of society is what he called the economic means and modes of production. At the very base of everything are, and by the way, Marx was a disciple of Darwin, as Freud was, as so many, Margaret Sanger and so many other people. But Marx said at the core of everything, at the foundation, he called it the structure of everything, or base, like the base of a pyramid, was economics. And out of those material economic forces, out of that is created political and social forces. And here's the part that blows my mind every time I read it in his work. He not only believed that economic forces created our beliefs and our dreams and our religion and everything else, he believes it creates our consciousness itself. Our consciousness does not create economic forces. Economic forces create our consciousness. We are mere products of our socio-economic milieu. And whenever you hear someone say like that, it always goes back to Marx. They might not be a Marxist in the political sense, but that concept goes back to Marx, that we are mere products of these deep economic forces over which we ultimately have no control. So Marx is a complete determinist. There is no free will of any kind. There is no choice or volition of any kind. We are products. Now, of course, as so many Marxists think, somehow Marx was able to step outside and see all of this, right? None of us can because we're products, but somehow the Marxist theorist has some strange ability to step outside and analyze these things, right? Again, that's the joke that happens over and over and over again. But again, what happens in Karl Marx is we lose our innate dignity and value and worth. We're no longer an individual. We are part of a group or a class. We are part of the bourgeoisie or the proletariat. Or today, we're not an individual. We are part of the class of women or black people or Hispanic people or gay people or whatever it happens to be. That's that identity politics. We cease to be an individual, moral, ethical creature endowed with individual innate, essential purpose and value and meaning, and we become a product of the forces around us. And I can't tell you how destructive that is, because what happens is we end up becoming a cog in the machine. Whether we're a cog in Nazi totalitarianism or a cog in Soviet totalitarianism or Maoist totalitarianism or even academic totalitarianism, it doesn't make a difference. But he has robbed us of our innate dignity as creatures created in the image of God, the imago Dei, the image of God. And that's why Marx has pushed us in that direction. We're still struggling with that. It's still there. It's still there at the very core of the social sciences, right? Again, Christians have fought very hard to break from that, but it's still there. And we have a hard time thinking outside that box. You know, Larry, there's this ongoing debate. Were our founding fathers secular Enlightenment or were they Judeo-Christian? Well, they're both, okay? But what we need to understand is everybody loves, Hume and all these, the secular Enlightenment. Out of the secular Enlightenment came this idea that we all have innate dignity, value, and worth. No. That's in the Enlightenment because they stole that idea from the Bible. If you are a secular humanist who only believes in Darwinism, there is no way you can get to this idea that every human being has innate value, worth, and dignity. It just doesn't happen. If we're the product of survival of the fittest, then there are dominant species and there are species that fall to the wayside. There's no such thing. So, yes, the Enlightenment did give us a sense of the innate dignity of man, but that's because they took it from the Judeo-Christian world. They're always, even modern scientists are always stealing from Christianity because they can't deal with the ramification of their own belief. They give us a completely materialistic worldview that turns us into machines, but they can't deal with that. No, we still have to have free will. And so they steal that idea from Christianity while attacking the very Christianity they stole the idea from.
Yeah, you say something, Lou, in the book that I found very powerful and very thought-provoking. You say, if it could be proven that Christ did not rise from the dead, I would leave the church and become a Stoic.
I do, and I say that to my students, and I shock them a little bit.
Yeah. You go on to say that if Jesus did not rise, if he was only a man, then we're on our own down here. If Jesus did not conquer death, and with it, sin and the devil, then all the religious rituals in the world are shams, powerless to save or transform or give new life. If Jesus didn't walk out of the tomb, then Christianity is the greatest hoax ever played on the human race. And if it is a hoax, then I, for one, would give up religion. You go on to say that you would opt to be a Stoic if Christianity were not true. Again, for our non-philosophers, what exactly is a Stoic, and how is Christianity perhaps both like and unlike Stoicism?
Well, let's talk about this, and this is chapter 10 of my book that I really enjoyed writing. Okay, first of all, let's just step back for a second. There was a famous thinker named Karl Popper, and he said that one of the criteria of a system that shows whether that worldview, that paradigm is true, is whether or not it's falsifiable. Right? If your worldview is true and real and answers all the questions, then it has to have the ability to be disproven. In other words, you've got to say, yes, I rest on this system, but I do admit that if you can show that this part of my system is false, then my system would fall apart. Right? It's got to be non-false. I would argue that Freudianism is not falsifiable because anytime you run into a glitch, they'll just say, "Oh, you're just resisting psychoanalysis." Right? That's just but no, Christianity is a falsifiable religion. Christianity rests upon a historical event called the resurrection, and if it could be proven that Jesus did not rise from the dead, then Christianity would be a hoax. And that's exactly what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. If Christ did not rise from the dead, then we are to be, of all people, the most pitied. Okay, so if Christ did not rise from the dead, then what he said wasn't true. And like I said, we're alone here. Okay, I mean, again, yes, Jesus was a prophet, but the world has got plenty of prophets. Okay, we don't have a lack of prophets to tell us how we should live. The problem is not that we lack prophets. The problem is that we don't follow them, and we can't, okay? So if Jesus is only a prophet and he did not conquer sin and Satan and death, then we're alone, okay? There's plenty of ideas out there, but there's no proof. There's no proof that God cares and that he has conquered the greatest of foes. So what do you do? What do I do? I'm now in a world where, I have a lot of respect for some of the things that Jews do and Muslims do and Buddhists do and Hindus do. But why would I join a system that doesn't answer all the questions, that doesn't have the power to save? And so my point would be, if Christ didn't rise from the dead, if Christianity is not true, and therefore God has never really spoken, at least not spoken in the way we need to hear, then what do I do? Well, I think the second, maybe this is a very male thing as opposed to a female thing, but the next thing I would do is play it safe. And the best way to play it safe is to become a Stoic. Every year I teach Marcus Aurelius, who wrote a thing called the Meditations, right? And he was writing. Other Stoics would include a person named Seneca. There's another person named Epictetus. Those are probably the three most famous Stoic writers from the ancient world. Marcus Aurelius also happened to be a Roman emperor, right? And in Stoicism, okay, the point is to follow your duty, do what is right, and live your life that way. Don't worry about what happens after you die, okay? Don't worry about where you came from. Okay? Just live a life of balance and moderation, do your duty, perform your function, and leave all those questions to other people. Now, again, I'm not a Stoic because Christ rose from the dead. But if Christ didn't rise from the dead and there's no other option, I do respect the Stoic who tries to live his life by duty, who tries to do what is right. And Stoicism does have overlaps with the teachings of Christ. Marcus Aurelius, who probably did not read the New Testament, often talks about each of us as a branch in a tree, or each of us as a part of a body. Very, very similar to what it says in the New Testament about how Christ is the vine, we are the branches. Very similar to Paul speaking about the body of Christ. So there is a good understanding of that kind of unity. But here's the problem, okay? When you lose the fact that Christ himself is the vine, or the branch, the vine into which the branches are, when you lose the fact that Christ himself is the body, Stoicism, which I think is the best option, has a danger to it. And the danger is that you just become a cog in the state. You just become part of the general will, as Rousseau would call it, and you sort of lose your individuality. Only in Christianity, where Christ is the vine and we are the branches, can we be one with the body of Christ, one with the church, one with Christ himself, and yet still be a full individual created by God. So Stoicism is good in its call to duty, but apart from a living, incarnate God who died and resurrected, apart from that, that duty can lose its joy, can lose its life, can lose its dynamism, and it can become merely playing itself and protecting yourself from life and not really getting anywhere. So I love Aurelius, but there's a sort of sadness to him. See, what happens in Stoicism that's good is it tells us to look within for strength, to look towards the inner light. But as Chesterton once said, the trouble is John begins by worshiping the inner light and ends up worshiping John, okay? And so what happens is you turn inward, not because the Holy Spirit is indwelling us, as in Christianity, but you turn inward and you end up stagnating because you're caught in an egocentric loop out of which you can't break. So, again, there's goodness in Stoicism. Epictetus is another great person to read. But I think that ultimately it cannot lead anywhere, right? And so, again, if Christ did not raise from the dead, let's protect ourselves. Let's try to be as good citizens as we can. But we've lost the ultimate joy and purpose and motivation. And in the end, we just kind of stagnate.
And there is a better way. Well, Lou, it's been a more than a pleasure. I'd say it's been an education. And on behalf of our listeners and Hank and the crew here at CRI, thanks to you, really not just for joining us, but for the decades that you've invested in research, writing, teaching, and your willingness to share the fruits of your labors with those of us genuinely wanting to love God with all our minds. As a reminder to our listeners, to receive a copy of Lou's book, Atheism on Trial, as our thanks for your gift in this critical month of June, the end of CRI's fiscal year, simply go to equip.org or phone 888-7000-CRI. That's 888-7000-CRI. Or by mail, just send your gift to CRI at Post Office Box 8500, Charlotte, North Carolina, 28271 is the zip. And for those eager to stand shoulder to shoulder with us on a regular basis in the battle for life and truth, Let me encourage you to become a member of CRI's support team. Just visit equip.org to see a terrific selection of equipping essential resources that we've selected, along with other benefits that you'll receive as a support team member. Perhaps the greatest benefit being the satisfaction of knowing that you're helping to equip fellow believers 24/7 at home and around the world to be effective witnesses for our risen Lord. That's it for this special edition of the Hank Unplugged podcast. God bless. Get out there and make a difference, and we'll see you next time.